Wonderful. Are y'all ready to go? Get the Zoom recording set up. How's my volume, by the way? Can y'all hear me over the air conditioning? Okay. So, last Sunday, I apologize for this. We had an SVE TV crew coming in for this special thing that we did at the 11 o'clock service. I got pulled away, so we weren't able to do this installment. That means that all will be here this morning, so we're doing a little bit of backtracking. If you recall from last time, we talked about the mission to the north. Is everyone somewhat familiar with that part of what we talked about? So we're picking up essentially with the mission to the north. Hopefully by the end of today, we'll be through St. Whilfrid. It's a lovely character. So onward we go. A bit of review. In the year 635, Oswald, who's the king of the Northumbrians, wins a battle in a place called Heavenfield and establishes himself as the sort of the dominant king in the north. He is a Christian. He has been trained by Irish monks over in Ireland. We don't exactly know where, but we assumed he sort of traveled around a number of different places. When he becomes the king in the north, he calls over to the Irish to have them send him some monks to help him proselytize the northern kingdom that he is the king of. They sent him a guy named Aidan. Oswald grants Aidan the island of Lindisfarne, which is the base that Christianity will have as it begins to spread in that region. And it remains a very powerful place of prayer, of pilgrimage, almost from the outset, from its beginnings. For those who are going on the pilgrimage trip that we'll have in September, this is one of the stops that we'll be making. So we'll be going over to the island of Lindisfarne and exploring there a little bit. So this is the far north of England. In terms of the country England, it is about the farthest north that you can go before you reach the border of Scotland. So if you see a sort of modern map of Scotland, you go over the North Sea, you look down at this most southern, southeasternmost point of Scotland, Holy Island of Lindisfarne is right there. Okay. So this is the place that will be the sort of the launching point for much of what happens in the church in the north for a very long time. So that's kind of a bit of a refresher from last time. As the church gets established, and this is again from 635. So Oswald comes in, he's a Christian king, he begins to help the spread of Christianity. The way that Christianity spreads in this region, and much of the Celtic areas that we're talking about, is through monasticism. Monastic communities get established, and that's what helps spread the faith. Now, none of these, not a single one of the buildings that are pictured here, are original Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, early English even establishments. These are all sort of Gothicized buildings that were put up in these places. But we have a fascinating, these are just a few examples of some of the places where the ruins show how long-lasting the Christian witness is in these areas. So Whitby, which is probably the most famous one we've heard of, there is I think that the abbey ruin dates to the 14th century, but it starts humble beginnings, Anglo-Saxon architecture, and then winds up becoming a major house, a major center of worship and monastic spirituality. And to this day, it remains fairly impressive. I would not recommend that you ever go to Whitby because it is a tourist trap. That would be like someone saying, "Oh, you should definitely go to Myrtle Beach. It's the best." It is the Myrtle Beach of Bram Stoker. Yeah. So it's a sort of whaling. Oh yeah, no, it's an important place, but it's just now it's sort of it's a tourist trap, very much so, which is unfortunate because it really is beautiful. But you got Hartlepool, Navigersburg, and Holdingham, Ripon. These are all sort of foundations that are begun in very sort of humble ways. Hartlepool becomes the one of the foundations of Hilda of Whitby. Hilda, who winds up going to Whitby. She starts her career off near Hartlepool, and there's still this day a large, massive parish church in Hartlepool. Navigersburg, St. Fursa, and that's a Roman fort that has still a functioning parish church. Coldingham is a monastic ruin, and Ripon, which is a minor cathedral. All of these places, they have these humble Christian beginnings, monastic communities of maybe 10, 15 people. They wind up becoming centers of pilgrimage, centers of prayer, and centers of power for the church as it spreads in the north. So this becomes key as we get further in and to start discussing the Synod of Whitby. So does anyone know what this image is? Anyone care to wager a guess? It looks like a calendar. Very good. Any guesses to what it might be a calendar of? Yes. Okay, so calendars, and I know this is going to sound incredibly dry and dull, but calendars, how do we tell time? How do we know when the date of Easter is? Does anyone know when the date of Easter is?
It's the first Sunday after the first full moon in the vernal equinox.
Okay. So we have that information now, but 1300 years ago, it was not really that simple. In fact, you have a prayer book with you. If you turn to the back of your prayer book, there's a section of it called Tables for Finding. You got a criminal, so it's sort of more towards the middle. Yeah. It's called Tables for Finding Holy Days, and it's a number of pages that goes through how you calculate the date of Easter. Keep going. Let's see if we can. That's yeah. Finding Holy Days. Okay, so tables. They begin on page 880 or 881. So this is stuff that really is only for kind of specialists. But if you get bored during the sermon and you ever really kind of research, this stuff becomes incredibly important. Because if you're operating with a solar calendar or a lunar calendar, chances are you're going to come up with some different dates. So how does Passover get calculated? How do we know when Passover is? Okay, and what is the Hebrew calendar based? It's lunar. So Passover always begins on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, which is their sort of the first month of their year. So, and that dates back to Exodus. It's the 14th day of the month of Nisan. So, how do we figure out what the date of Easter is? Do we go with the lunar Jewish calendar, or do we go with a solar calendar, a Gregorian calendar, and sort of calculate how days, months, weeks pass based on the cycles of the sun, or the Earth's rotation around the sun? Revolution. So this becomes a live issue, because if you've got a church, a group of people that want to celebrate Easter, which is the principal feast of the church year, it is the feast of the resurrection, and you've got half the room saying, well, I think we should probably just do it on the 14th day of the lunar month of Nisan. And you got the other half saying, no, actually, we need to calculate this based on when the vernal equinox is and find when the Sunday after that is. We're going to have two groups of people celebrating Easter at a completely different time. It doesn't always overlap. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So, and then this becomes a very live issue around the time of the Council of Nicaea. So, and actually, people that were dedicated to saying no, the 14th day of the month of Nisan is when we ought to celebrate Easter. Were condemned as heretics. This is serious business for Christians, right? So that controversy still sort of percolates down, but there are different ways of calculating the date of Easter. I'm not going to go into how complicated this gets, but basically you've got two systems at work in the Celtic world. You've got one tradition that basically says there's the 14th day of the month of Nisan. Let's celebrate it on the Sunday after that. And then you've got a Roman tradition which says no, actually on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the vernal equinox, that's when we need to celebrate. I think the Orthodox go with this called Celtic calculation. It's closer to it. That's, you might know more about that. No, it's sometimes actually quite close. In fact, the controversy that crops up in the Celtic versus Roman church, it's not big. So it's sort of the same thing that I'm talking about. But say the Greeks say that Finian.
Instead of before Sunday. But the difference on.
Guys, what the Greeks do is technically speaking more close to what the Celts did, because they're going with a system that's sometimes our Easters overlap with the Greek Orthodox Easter, but not always. And that's what happened in the Celtic versus Roman world. Sometimes Easter overlapped, but a lot of times it didn't. You know, a week or two difference. But that's I'd have to be interested. We're looking into what the Greek Orthodox how they get there. But for the purposes of this conversation, the difference between how the Celtic Church calculated the date of Easter and how the Roman Church calculated the date of Easter meant that we wound up having two different celebrations of Easter in the same year. Not always, but close enough that it caused some problems, especially when you've got a Kentish Roman princess coming up north to marry a king who was Celtic. So Celtic observance is happening in the royal household, and the Roman observance is happening a week or two later in the same household. Bede says this is a big problem. It's not that big a problem. It's kind of blowing things out of the proportion. But when you've got King Oswald, who was studied over in Ireland, who has brought in an Irish monk to spread Christianity in the north of England, what do you think is going to wind up happening? Those Irish monks, those Celtic traditions are going to be imbibed by the northern Christians. And so they're going to observe the Celtic calculation of the date of Easter. Well, this becomes a problem, because you have the Roman traditions also sort of migrating up from the south. So this leads to a bit of a kerfuffle. This is what Bede has to say, and this is Bede, who is an incredibly partisan supporter of the Roman position of the calculation of the date of Easter. In fact, you could say that Bede has an axe to grind, and only one axe beyond Jesus is Lord. It's Easter. This is the big thing for Bede. Here's what he has to say about Aidan. Whilst Aidan lived, the difference about the observance of Easter was patiently tolerated by all, for they well knew that though he could not keep Easter contrary to the custom of those who had sent him, yet he industriously labored to practice the works of faith, piety, and love according to the custom of all holy men, for which he was deservedly beloved by all. So Bede, on the one hand, has got, I want to make sure that everybody knows what the proper calculation of the date of Easter is. And Aidan is a holy guy. How do you mix the two? He tries to thread the needle. I do not approve or praise his observance of Easter at the wrong time. So he's wrong. This is wrong. Either through ignorance of the canonical time appointed, or if he knew it, being prevailed upon by the authority of his nation not to adopt. Yet this I prove in him, that in the celebration of his Easter, the object she had at heart and reverence and preached was the same as ours, to wit, the redemption of mankind through the passion, resurrection, and ascension of heaven into heaven of the man Christ Jesus. So, again, main source of information about this controversy is Bede. He is incredibly partisan, and even he has to admit the Irish observance, there's holiness on their side. In fact, almost all of the sort of main players in this, Bede has nothing negative to say about their personalities. He's just saying they're just wrong. They're just wrong. Get the date of Easter correctly calculated. So this leads to the Synod of Whitby, which again was a minor thing. Bede sort of gives it this major glossy appearance of a huge conference. It's not. It's a sort of minor church conference, but it does have very wide ramifications. Now, the Synod of Whitby takes place in. You can pronounce how it's actually pronounced. I'll give you a dollar. Srenelslaw. It's in Whitby, and the abbess who hosts it is a member of the royal household of the Northumbrian kingdoms, and she brings together all these people. They decide they want to have this council at Whitby, and at Whitby, you see church politics at its absolute best, because you've got two very powerful figures, and the king, the son, and they're sort of at loggerheads in terms of how do you calculate the date of Easter. Now, the king is not in favor of the Celtic, is not in favor of the Roman observance. And most of the major magnates that are there also not in favor of the Roman observance. They're used to how they've been doing things. The Celtic calculation of Easter is the big deal. Actually, we'll go back. But the king's son, Ecgbert, has a protege or one of his allies, a guy by the name of WIlfrid. WIlfrid, according to Bede, stands up and gives this wonderful, just amazing presentation of why the Roman customs are right. Basically, the argument that WIlfrid makes at the end of the day is St. Peter holds the keys to heaven. If you want to get in heaven, you might want to go with Peter. Peter's in Rome. And that wins. That's how Bede sort of presents the argument. Now, we can go into all the sort of, the political machinations behind it. But the outcome of the Synod of Whitby is that the Roman observance of Easter is declared to be the normative practice and should be the normative practice for the entire church in England. Done. This upsets quite a lot of people. In fact, most of the monks who had gone over to Lindisfarne go back. They're just like, we're out, we're going to go back to Ireland. A lot of the places that have been populated by Celtic monasteries, Celtic monastic foundations, they also say, we're out, we're gone. As a result of the Synod of Whitby, WIlfrid is granted a monastery or two.
I know.
The king's son, Ecgbert. So, Ecgbert grants him this, he gives him a monastic community, says, you're going to be the abbot, because the power structure is the king gets to the point who he wants to be the abbot. WIlfrid goes into a monastery called Melrose and wants to enforce Roman customs in Melrose. The abbot of that monastery decides to leave, to go back to his original monastery, along with one of his proteges by the name of Cuthbert. So Cuthbert winds up getting exiled from his original home monastery. This winds up being helpful. We'll get there in a second. Just to give you a little bit of background about WIlfrid, because we're going to on this trip to the north of England, we're going to go see a couple of places that WIlfrid is directly responsible for founding, setting up. Excuse me. So, after the Synod of Whitby is over, King's son Ecgbert wants him to be ordained bishop of Lindisfarne, essentially bishop of Northumbria, and sends him to be ordained in Gaul, modern-day France. WIlfrid takes his sweet southern time to get there and back. It takes well over a year, all of this to sort of take place. Now, if you send someone off to get ordained, expecting them to return, and they're gone, you haven't heard anything from them, what do you think is going to happen? Someone else gets appointed. So the king and his son have a little bit of a falling out. The king says, guess what? I'm going to appoint someone else. He appoints someone else. The king's son leads a failed revolt against his father, and a new bishop is ordained in his stead. So Wilfrid comes back. He's bishop now. I'm expecting to come into my diocese to great aplomb. Well, sorry. Someone else has actually taken the position because you were gone for a year. He appeals. And a lot of this, and again, Bede sort of glosses over some of the ugly details in Wilfrid's life by a different guy named Edius Stephanus. There's a little bit more of the ugliness and nasty politics involved in it, during which Wilfrid is the absolute hero of everything. He gets his appeal heard by the Archbishop of Canterbury. His appeal is approved. Archbishop of Canterbury gets him reinstated. He goes back up north to his diocese. You'd think that that's all well and good. Actually, no. The Archbishop of Canterbury reinstates him, then wants to break his diocese up because I think I said this earlier. The diocese of Northumbria is massive. It basically runs from the river Humber all the way up to the southern parts of Scotland. It's an immense geographical area. And so Theodore wants to break up that massive diocese so that it's a little bit easier to manage by several people. Well, you think that Wilfrid is happy with that? No. He makes another appeal. He gets exiled. He appeals all the way up to Rome. Rome says, actually, Wilfrid's got a case. You can't break up his diocese without his consent. He goes back to Northumbria. The king at the time basically says, I don't care what Rome has to say, I'm going to ignore him. And he goes into exile again. Comes back in after another appeal to Rome, is exiled again. Anyway, you see all this. He goes to Rome a lot. This becomes important because in the church of Hexham, there's a crypt. This dates to the 7th century. This is in the 600s now. You've got this this rambunctious traveling bishop who goes to Rome, sees some of the sights in Rome, especially catacombs, is so wowed by it that he decides he wants to actually go back to England and reconstruct a version of these catacombs in one of his churches, which he then does. That catacomb is still extant. You can go down and see it, which is I think that's kind of neat. You've got a 7th century network that was constructed by one of these figures that we can still go and see. Like he's directly responsible for happens. That's pretty neat. After all these appeals, after many sort of ugly fights with local magnates and other folks, which involved in one instance, he and his followers getting out of a boat and being attacked by East Anglians, I think, and then cutting all of the East Anglians down. So this is not just, sort of a pacifist bishop. This guy is willing to go get his hands dirty. He winds up winning his appeals and is granted 2 foundations, the foundations of Ripon and Hexham, and that's Guy's. So he has been an incredibly controversial figure his entire life. This becomes important when we start talking about Cuthbert. The other figure at the Synod of Whitby is Hilda. If you've been into the church, y'all know the women's window in the cathedral? So Hilda of Whitby is one of the figures in the women's window, which is right next to the Gary Chapel. At the back, you're walking in off of Wentworth Street, it's over to the left, and there's the women's window. I think that's the most modern window in the church. Is that right? 1960s? Anyway, so Hilda of Whitby, a little bit of background on her. So King Edwin, the first Christian king of Northumbria, it's his great niece. She's in the court of Edwin and was baptized. Was baptized with Edwin's court on Easter Day in the year 627. When the nasty Mercians overrun the kingdom of Northumbria and kill King Edwin. She flees down south with Edwin's now widow, Ethelberga, and Ethelberga sets up a nunnery. It's presumed that Hilda begins her monastic life with Ethelberga in this nunnery. We don't really know anything about what she does until about the age of 33. The age of 33, this is where her story picks back up according to Bede. And Bede says that she comes back to Northumbria because Aidan requests that she come back and found a nunnery. She decides to do so. She's in Hartlepool for a very short time, and then she's off to Whitby to found the monastic community in Whitby, which is also the original name of Whitby is Streonoslach. Someone with a better background in Old English can probably help me with that one. But Whitby is one of these double monasteries that comes out of the Celtic tradition, which means you've got some small houses that maybe house 2, 3 cells. The men and the women live separately. So it's both sexes are in the monastery. They worship together, they live apart. And typically the abbess, and it normally is a woman in charge of the foundation, it is under the rule of an abbess. Whitby becomes one of these double monasteries in the Celtic tradition, and it houses a lot of very important figures who go on to be big players in the church. There are no less than 5 bishops who work directly under Hilda of Whitby. And so in terms of the formation that this one foundation has, and it's the importance of the north of England, it's massive, massive. So again, she's renowned for her wisdom and energy. Kings regularly seek her counsel. And that's partially because she comes from the royal line. So she's very well connected in the royal family, which is why when the Synod of Whitby is called together, the natural place to hold it is Whitby, because you've got the niece or the grandniece of a king who is the head of this monastic community. Where else would you want to go? You know, you've got church and state coming together quite nicely. So, I had to do this. So, one of the other issues that was at stake at the Council of Whitby, the Synod of Whitby, beyond Easter, has to do, in terms of the difference between Roman observance and Celtic observance, is how monks are going to cut their hair. This is not that big a deal, but it's I find it rather fascinating that you've got a difference, sort of a difference in the way that things are done. That there's, a haircut that identifies you as a monk, that becomes something of a flashpoint. You've got different monks with different haircuts wandering around like, well, I've got a crown, I'm with Rome. I've got a, whatever that is.
What's the guy that's way over on the left?
What's that?
What's the guy that's way over on the left?
That's the Celtic tonsure. It's just basically, it's you're shaving the front part of your head, or maybe leaving a small little, there's a wedge, but it usually involves shaving the front. And the Roman tonsure is you're shaving the top, creating a crown. So that's another one of these issues that crops up. I love the artwork in here because the Celts all just, they look very sort of, oh, maybe it's well lovely. We're happy, and the Romans just all look miserable. Especially this guy on the bottom here. So that all sort of gets sorted out at the Synod of Whitby. I do want to bring this up because also at Whitby, foundation of Whitby. This is where I wish Church were here. If she could read this. At the monastery of Whitby, under Hilda, there is a cowherd by the name of Ecgbert, or Cuthbert, who is relatively uneducated, has never learned to play any instrument, has never been taught the art of composition, and is a relatively unimportant figure in the Whitby foundation. He's not a monk. He's sort of a worker at the monastery who helps keep the cows, but he's not a monk. And he's as the story that Bede tells goes, one night he's sitting around with some of his compatriots, and they're passing around a lute or a harp. And say, hey, sing a song for us. And everyone's kind of passing the harp around and at least able to put something together, a couple of notes, whatever. And it comes to him and he says, I can't do anything. And he goes away in dismay. As the story goes, he has a dream where he encounters an unnamed person. It's an angel. And the angel basically says, you are going to now sing about creation. He protests, I can't, I do not have the gift. First, this angelic figure persists and says, will sing me a song of the wonders of creation. He proceeds to do so. Writes it down, manages to have, I guess you'd call it a miraculous intervention where he's given the gift of music, composition. He goes and talks to Hilda. She calls in some scholars, some other people who basically verify this guy was an illiterate peasant, did not have any skill, and now all of a sudden he's able to compose these hymns. And he goes on to compose. Bede tells us numerous hymns, but we only have the text of one. This is one of the earliest surviving examples of Old English written. This, the English translation, such as it is over on the right there. I'll read through it real quick because there's one little phrase in there that actually winds up becoming more influential than you could imagine. Now we shall honor heaven kingdom's ward, the measurer's might, his mind plans, the work of the glory Father, as he of each wonder eternal Lord, the origin established. Basically saying God created the world, right? He first created for the children of men heaven for a roof, holy shaper. Then middle earth. Well, how about that? Thank you, Tolkien. Mankind's Lord, eternal Lord, after created the lands for men, Lord Almighty. So again, this relatively obscure figure living in a Celtic monastery writes these hymns, writes these verses. And one line is picked up by a 20th century author and turned into Middle Earth, Frodo, and all those things. So the way that Cadman's life sort of comes to an end, it's he spends the rest of his life in the monastery of Whitby, and as Bede tells us, he realizes, and he's fairly young, he's probably in his early 50s. Life expectancy back then is not that great. He realizes he's about to die, basically asks to have the viaticum, or the Holy Eucharist, brought to him. He receives it, and all of his brothers are going, you're not even sick. Why are you asking to have this brought to you? And he dies like as soon as he receives it. Strange. So, yes. And then I have to tell this. So one of the things, and this is I think I might have mentioned this up front, that when we start talking about the Celtic tradition, it is not always the sort of romanticized version of, nature and femininity and peace and love that some people give it. It is not always like that. So, case in point, St. Fursa. This is an Irish monk. He's originally from Ireland. He's born in Ireland. And in very much the vein of the Celtic tradition, he decides he wants to become a pilgrim for Christ. And so he uproots himself. He goes away from his homeland. He decides, I want to go and set my entire life at God's disposal. he goes over to a place in East Anglia, which is think of where Norwich is. Do y'all know where Norwich is? Roughly? Okay. So there's a sort of bulge. There's a bulge in England that sticks out in the North Sea. That's East Anglia. So he goes over to East Anglia and as a pilgrim for Christ is successful at conversion. He converts a lot of people to Christianity. He gets sick. And he has a vision. First, he has a vision of the glory of heaven and the joys that await the faithful at their death. Next night, he has a vision of hell and the torments that await the unfaithful at their death. And so again, if we're thinking of Celtic Christianity as just sunshine and rainbows, it's not the whole story, because this guy is held up as one of the absolute prime examples of what a pilgrim monk ought to be. This guy's coming out of that tradition. Bede, in terms of recounting this guy's story, has this much to say about Fursa's vision of heaven, this much to say about Fursa's vision of hell, and why his preaching depended upon saying, you need to watch out for the fire and the brimstone. So we have fire and brimstone preachers, even as far back as that. So go back to here. Okay, y'all see where in the middle there? That's a early English church in Nabersburg, which the way that Bede tells it, Fursa decides he wants to live as a hermit and he wants to establish himself in a sort of secure location. And there's an abandoned Roman fortress near Nabersburg, and you can still see the Roman walls. And he builds a small hermitage in Nabersburg. And to this day, there's still a church, it's still functioning as a parish church within the Roman ruin at Nabersburg. So again, this is what I find rather fascinating. Saint Fursa is one guy, builds a small little ramshackle setup near a Roman fort ruins. He gains some fame as a Christian who is good at spreading the gospel. Still a church to this day. It's basically, it's not St. Fursa's church, but that's a longer story. I'm not going to get into that. But it was originally, like, there's a church that's been there since around the time. So again, if we think that our Christian witness can't last for generations, or we think that somehow our ability to follow Christ cannot make a difference for generations to come, I submit to you, St. Fursa. Now, hopefully none of y'all are going to have a dream about hell. But again, that's just sort of, if we're ever in doubt that our witness cannot make a difference in the world, I would submit to you all of these different figures that we're talking about, because they have and they continue to make an impact. In fact, Cadmon, just mentioned, is still to this day the importance of that Old English verse. I think it's one of 3 examples of the earliest Old English verse that we have. And I'll go back to that real quick. This is where I wish we had Trish here, because she could actually read it and make it sound like it's supposed to sound. Okay. The first line there, now we shall honor heaven kingdom's Lord. I don't know what that says. Skillen Ergen, I guess. Heavenrikes word. Does that sound like heaven's Lord? Or heaven's kingdom's Lord? Heaven kingdom's Lord? So again, you can sort of get this early example of what becomes the English language. Which I think is rather fascinating. So, okay. It is now 2 past until, so.
Yeah.
I will stop there, so. Saint Cuthbert. We'll pick up with Saint Cuthbert next week, but again, the thing I'm hoping that y'all remember, Wilfrid. The exceptionally combative prelate. Who wins at the Council of Whitby, as a result of winning the Council of Whitby is granted. This monastic foundation where Cuthbert and his mentor are. And they leave. So you'd think there'd be some soreness there, right? I'll leave you with that. Yeah.